So as I mentioned, we're talking about biological membranes today. So we're clear that biological membranes have a number of vital functions in maintaining the cell, maintaining homeostasis. Before we get started today, I would like for us to take a moment to jot down some of the learning objectives that we should capture by the end of this talk, okay? One of the main things we want to do is evaluate the importance of biological membranes to the cell, okay? We want to be able to understand why this is such an important structure and what happens if the integrity of this structure is compromised, okay? We want to be able to describe the composition of biological membranes, and this is basically making sure that you understand the major components that make up a biological membrane, all right? We'll talk a little bit about those proteins and lipids that are found in biological membranes. We want to summarize the function of membrane proteins. So one of the things that we'll take away here today is that the biological membranes are mostly made up of lipids and proteins, okay? And so we have these membrane proteins that have various functions in regulating the cell. So we'll take a look at a few of those, all right? And then we'll further characterize this plasma membrane as a selectively permeable barrier. Okay, this concept of being selectively permeable gives us an idea that it's going to be selectively permeable to certain substances, that not all substances would be able to readily cross this plasma membrane, okay? And so for those larger molecules that cannot readily permeate the cell membrane without assistance, there are some other mechanisms in place to get these substances across the membrane, all right? So we'll look at some methods of diffusion, facilitated diffusion, active transport. We'll be able to compare and sort of contrast forms of passive transport versus active transport, okay? So diffusion, osmosis, which specifically refers to the movement of water. Okay, and then we'll look at active transport in contrast as a means for getting these larger complex molecules and ions into the cell, all right? And we'll look at some other structures and functions that take place at the membrane level, okay? So as I mentioned before, biological membranes are important because cells have this important job of maintaining an appropriate internal environment, right, in order to carry out the chemical processes that are required for life. So we've talked about a number of these characteristics of life, chemical reactions that are taking place, metabolic activity, and so forth. One of the jobs of the cell is to maintain homeostasis, all right? This plasma membrane is a very unique structure in that you're gonna find this structure on all cell types, right? So in our previous lessons, we've talked a little bit about structures that may be present in one cell type, but not present in another cell type, such as the cell wall, right? We know we can find the cell wall in some bacteria cells. You're not gonna find them in animal cells, but you'll find them in plant cells. You may find them in fungi, right? There are structures for a point of comparison that, again, may be present in certain eukaryotic cells, but may not be present in prokaryotic cells. But the plasma membrane, write this down, the plasma membrane is a structure that every cell contains. Every cell is surrounded by a plasma membrane. Okay, so if we were in the classroom, I would, in a way, illustrate the structure of the cell, and I would start with this circle, right? Sort of a 2D image of a cell. That circle that I draw represents that plasma membrane, okay? One of the most—
Can you repeat that, please?
What is the plasma membrane?
Yeah, you said write it down. Plasma membrane is
that every cell contains a plasma membrane. That's the first point that I made. Just highlighting that in contrast to like other structures like the cell wall, capsules, and things like that may be present on some cells, may not be present on other cells, but every single cell has a plasma membrane. Okay, that's that first barrier of protection around the cell. And one of its most fundamental jobs is to separate the cell from the external environment. Okay, so I like to think about it kind of like our skin, right? That separates our body, our internal body, from the rest, from the external environment. Okay. again, looking at some of the vital roles of the cell, one of the other things that it does in addition to separating it from the external environment is this plasma membrane regulates the passage of materials into and out of the cell. That's a very fundamental function, okay? If you just think about the cell in and of itself, we think about the cell as a living entity, right? Just like your body, like you have a need for things to come into your body, right? And then you also have a need to to release things from your body, right? Waste and so forth has to be ejected or removed from your body. And so when you're thinking about the cell, the way that the cell is set up and organized, things need to be into the cell. The cell does have a need for nutrients and other requirements, water, gas exchange, carbon dioxide, oxygen. These are all going to be substances that may need to pass through into the cell at some point. Waste products may need to leave the cell at some point. And so we're understanding that the plasma membrane is going to be one major point of regulation for that to happen, regulating the passage of materials into and out of the cell. Okay. So function, we're clear on the function of the plasma membrane. In its most basic level, the plasma membrane has two jobs: separate the cell from the external environment, regulate what's coming into and going out of the cell. All right, that's function. Let's look at structure. Let's look at the structure of the plasma membrane, okay? The plasma membrane, in a general sense, is a complex structure of lipids and protein molecules assembled together, okay? And that complex structure of lipids and proteins, again, has a number of jobs that the cell relies on in order to maintain that homeostatic environment, okay? Vital functions of the plasma membrane. Here are some more. Jot these 4 down. We've gotten 2 of them. Regulating the passage of materials into and out of the cell, all right? It also, the plasma membrane serves as a surface for chemical reactions to take place, right? It serves as a way for cells to adhere to other cells, right? We know that tissues are made when cells interact and adhere together. So that cell-cell adhesion takes place at the plasma membrane level. The plasma membrane also serves as a means to transmit signals, right, between the environment and the inside of the cell. So there's definitely signal transduction and communication going on between the cell and its environment. That's taking place by way of that plasma membrane and structures that are present on that cell membrane, particularly those membrane proteins that we mentioned earlier. Right? So there's a lot that goes on here at this plasma membrane level. All right, let's look more at the structure of this biological membrane. If you had to describe the structure of the plasma membrane, write this down. I want you to describe this structure as a phospholipid bilayer. The structure of the plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. And what that means is that we have 2 layers, that this cell membrane consists of an arrangement of 2 layers of phospholipids sort of interacting together, forming this sheet-like structure. So we got 2 layers of lipids that's gonna form a continuous barrier around the cell. All right, so we've got a layer of this is a phospholipid picture right here, okay? This one structure right here is a phospholipid. All right, you have a head and a tail making up this phospholipid. And this phospholipid is one of the major biological molecules that we need to make up to sustain life, right? So we had our carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. So phospholipids are a specific type of lipid, okay? And this phospholipid bilayer right here, we have 2 layers of lipids. We have a layer of lipid on the top and we have a layer of lipids here on the bottom. And this phospholipid bilayer structure would basically form a continuous barrier around the cell. And this is what's illustrated over here in this picture, okay? We have 2 layers of phospholipids. Characteristically, we say that phospholipids are amphipathic molecules. Write this term down, amphipathic. Okay, this term amphipathic refers to the fact that this molecule has both a hydrophobic and a hydrophilic component. Okay, you do need to know this about the structure of the phospholipid, that it's an amphipathic molecule. So you've got a head region and you've got a tail region on the phospholipid. The heads are polar, they're hydrophilic. The head regions are the regions of the molecule that interact with water. So they are hydrophilic, okay? The tail regions are going to be hydrophobic. They're going to be buried on the inside of this lipid bilayer, tucked away from water. And so if you direct your attention again over to this picture here of the cell, what you see here are two continuous layers of phospholipids, okay, creating this barrier around the cell. And we see we have these hydrophilic heads facing outward, which is an aqueous environment, water, right? The external compartment of this external to the cell is an aqueous environment, as well as inside of the cell is an aqueous environment. So we see the polar heads also on the inside of the cell. And so these hydrophobic tails are going to be buried in the middle, sort of creating that barrier between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell. You should certainly be able to describe in a general sense the structure of a plasma membrane, telling me that it's a phospholipid bilayer, understanding that it's sort of a, I think some of your textbooks are still referring to it as a fluid dynamic, like a mosaic, right? Where we don't have a, this isn't a static structure, right? This is actually a fluid structure, right? Where you have these phospholipids interacting very, very close together, right? But it does not suggest that there's no possibility of penetrating it. All right. And because as we'll see in the next couple of slides is that there are certain substances that can penetrate or permeate this membrane. Okay. So it is a fluid mosaic. Okay. It's not a static structure that cannot be penetrated. Okay. And so these phospholipids form a bilayer, right? As the name suggests, we're just talking about two layers of lipids. Again, understanding that this hydrophilic head is facing outward and the hydrophobic tails are going to be buried on the inside. All right. And that's going to be, if you look at this 3D image here, we see this 3D barrier of this phospholipid bilayer around this cell. I said that the major components of the plasma membrane were lipids and proteins. Okay, we're clear about the phospholipid as the specific type of lipid in biological membranes. And so let's turn our attention then to the membrane proteins. Okay, these proteins that are found in our membrane, or in our plasma membrane, are also very important. They have some very important roles in cellular activity. Okay, so cell membrane is a phospholipid bilayer, right? If we're still describing our structure here, we have a phospholipid bilayer with proteins embedded inside this phospholipid bilayer. And so what are some of the roles of these proteins that can be found in the plasma membrane? Jot these down. One of the most important jobs of those proteins are to transport material into and out of the cell. Okay? Transport materials into and out of the cell. So we'll see in another couple slides how membrane proteins can function as transporters and as channels or pores or openings in order to facilitate the crossing of large molecules into and out of the cell. These membrane proteins also play a role in transmitting information. Okay, so signal transduction. Okay, there's receptor ligand activity happening at the membrane level. Okay, there's also cell-cell interaction, cell-cell adhesion. Okay, connecting cells to other cells. So you've got proteins that are embedded on this plasma membrane that can facilitate the formation of tissues, right? We know that tissues are made from cells. Okay, so do have a clear understanding of the function and structure and function of the plasma membrane and its components, that phospholipid bilayer with those proteins embedded. Okay, these proteins that are embedded in that plasma membrane have some very important roles for cellular activity. You should definitely have that. It has a role in transporting substances into the cell, transmitting information, as well as connecting cells to other cells. So let's classify two types of membrane proteins. There are two major classes of membrane proteins that are defined by how closely they are associated with that lipid bilayer. So if you turn your attention to this picture that I have down in this right-hand corner, we have a structure here. This is a phospholipid bilayer, okay? This red structure is a phospholipid bilayer. We have our red polar heads that are gonna be hydrophilic, right? We have them on the external compartments, or the external of the cell, extracellular. And then we also have these on the intracellular parts. The blue structures that you see here are membrane proteins, okay? And you see various types and shapes and sizes of membrane proteins here. And these membrane proteins can be classified based on how tightly or how loosely associated with the plasma membrane that they are. We can have some that are going to be tightly embedded in the plasma membrane in such a way that if you try to remove one of these proteins, then you run the risk of compromising the integrity of this membrane, which basically would lead to you disrupting this plasma membrane, destroying it, okay? And those are going to be defined as integral membrane proteins. But then you have other proteins that are loosely associated with the membrane. They're kind of in the on the peripheral, and that's what we refer to them as peripheral membrane proteins, because they're not firmly embedded throughout that membrane, right? They're located usually on the inner or outer surfaces of this plasma membrane. And so they're not as, I won't say that they're not as important, but you don't run the risk of rupturing or destroying the cell should you try and remove one. So two major classes of membrane proteins based on how tightly associated they are with the lipid bilayer. We have integral membrane proteins, and then we have peripheral membrane proteins. Write those two terms down. You should definitely be able to contrast these types of proteins. If I showed you an image or a diagram and I asked you to identify which protein is integral versus one that is considered to be peripheral, we know that integral membrane proteins are going to be firmly bound to the membrane. They typically extend both in and out of the cell, so they're going to span the whole width of that cell membrane, right? You can look at it and make a determination that if you try to remove this protein, you basically would disrupt that lipid bilayer. It would no longer be an intact structure should you try and remove one of these integral proteins, okay? And so we sometimes refer to integral proteins as transmembrane proteins. As we can see, this is an example of a transmembrane protein here in blue, as it extends all the way throughout that membrane, and you have components on both the intracellular environment as well as this extracellular environment, okay? So this is a transmembrane protein that spans all the way through our lipid bilayer, okay? By definition, we're going to say that peripheral membrane proteins are those that are not embedded in the lipid bilayer. They're typically going to be located on the inner and outer surfaces of the membrane. All right, so this is an example of a peripheral protein. Do take some time to come back and make sure that you can contrast these two types of proteins and identify them based on locale, where they're located in this plasma membrane. Okay. So those are two classes of membrane proteins. So I talked about some other functions of membrane proteins. I said that they can assist in attachment and adhesion or anchoring. we said that those membranes can assist with transporting molecules across the membrane, right? And then we can also imagine that there's, you know, we mentioned that there are chemical reactions taking place at the cell membrane. And so we may have some proteins there that have enzymatic activity, okay? Enzymatic activity. We know that enzymes are very important in maintaining homeostasis in terms of catalyzing reactions. Okay, so by definition, proteins that have enzymatic activity are going to function to catalyze reactions near the surface of that cell. Okay, so chemical reactions do take place. Transport molecules across the cell. So we have proteins that can form channels, okay, gates, openings that selectively allow for the passage of substances. All right. Those are going to be our transporter proteins that create sort of this channel. You know what a channel is? It's like an opening that's going to allow for things to cross that cell membrane like glucose. Anchoring, okay, there are some membrane proteins such as integrins that attach the cell to these extracellular matrices, okay, so it sort of contributes to the structure of the cell, okay. And so these are some other ancillary functions of membrane proteins. So jot a few of those down, spend some time coming back to look at those. All right, so signal transduction here is what's being illustrated by the presence of these receptor proteins. And when the ligands that are necessary to stimulate this receptor activity, when this ligand binds, then we have signal transduction taking place here at the plasma membrane. So the proteins embedded in the membrane can function as receptors for signaling and signal transduction. Okay, these are just some more illustrations for those of us that are visual for some of the major functions of membrane proteins. Okay, they can function in transport. These membranes can function in enzymatic activity, signal transduction, intercellular joining, cell-cell recognition, and attachment to that extracellular matrix. Okay, do jot those down. And so real quick, before we look at some other ways in which substances can get into and out of the cell, let's recap here what these biological membranes are and what they're doing. Okay, so we're saying that biological membranes are fluid dynamic. These are closed systems or structures that separate the inside from the outside of the cells and the compartments within cells, right? So this purple structure right here represents our plasma membrane, biological membrane, okay? If this is our biological membrane and this is our cell, we know that we have a watery solution that exists outside of the cell, okay? And so one of the functions, again, this is just for those of us that are visual, one of the functions of this biological membrane is to allow some things to enter and some things to leave the cell, okay? This plasma membrane also functions to keep inside and separate the inside of the cell from the outside of the cell, okay? This plasma membrane functions to recognize things and respond to it, okay? And so we're also clear that inside of the cell is also a different watery solution in that cytoplasm, okay? So biological membranes are important. They have some very important jobs to do. And so then that leads us to this conversation about permeability, right? I mentioned earlier that the cell membrane is not a static structure where it's just there and it's solid and nothing can permeate it, okay? Cell membrane permeability refers to this idea that things can or may not be able to pass across the plasma membrane. Okay, and so in an attempt to try and maintain homeostasis, the cell must regulate chemical traffic across that plasma membrane. Okay, And so these structures here that are responsible for regulating the passage of traffic can be classified as either being something that is permeable or something that is impermeable, right? If a structure is permeable, by definition, write it down, permeable means that it's going to allow for substances to pass through it. If a structure is permeable, it's going to allow for substances to pass through it. If a structure is impermeable, it does not allow for the substances to pass through. Well, the cell membrane is defined as a selectively permeable. So it's not all the way permeable, it's not all the way impermeable. And so some of your textbooks may say semi-permeable. Okay, we're going to use the term selectively permeable to make sure that we understand that the cell is selective on what things can pass and when. Okay, and so a selectively permeable membrane is one that is going to allow for some substances to pass, but not all substances can readily permeate and move through that membrane. Okay, we're going to see here shortly how other mechanisms are going to be required to get those larger complex molecules across that cannot easily permeate that cell and diffuse across without assistance. Okay, so write this down. Make sure you have in your notes that the plasma membrane is a selectively permeable barrier that selectively regulates what substances can pass through and which cannot. And so we say that the plasma membrane is a highly selective permeability barrier, okay? And based on the needs of the cell in terms of nutrients, ions, water, that's going to dictate which substances can pass, right? Mechanisms are in place for these transporters and pumps to respond to the needs of the cell, communicating with the external environment, communicating with stimuli in order to respond and allow for substances to be able to penetrate that cell. Okay, so examples of things that are going to easily permeate the cell. Write this down. The most permeable substances are going to be those that are small hydrophobic molecules, basically those like things like gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide. These are going to be substances that can easily cross that plasma membrane. Okay, small hydrophobic molecules. An exception is going to be water. Water can also easily move through this plasma membrane very slowly without any assistance. Now, this is an exception because water is polar. All right. So things that are going to be readily permeable, easily permeable are going to be small hydrophobic molecules. Think about gases, okay, with water being an exception. Now, substances that are relatively impermeable, right, meaning that it cannot just move across this membrane unassisted. Those are going to be larger charged ions, large polar molecules such as the amino acids, glucose. These larger complex molecules cannot just move across that membrane unassisted. Okay. And in terms of these being polar molecules, water is the exception because it can penetrate that membrane really easily. Okay. So be able to sort of identify or recognize that gases and so forth, these smaller nonpolar molecules can move pretty easily through the plasma membrane, whereas these larger, more complex molecules are not going to move through as easily and they're going to require assistance. Okay, and so that's when these transport proteins come into play. All right, so transport proteins are going to be found in all biological membranes. Okay, and they function to move needed molecules through the membrane. Okay, so those sugars, amino acids, ions, salts, all those things that the cell may need, transport proteins are going to help to get those substances across that membrane. Okay, Write this down. There are two main types of transport proteins, okay? Each of them transporting specific molecules across the cell. We have carrier proteins and channel proteins. Write those two down. Two types of transport proteins, carrier proteins and channel proteins. Carrier proteins are sometimes referred to as transporters because, as the name suggests, carrier proteins function by binding to the molecule that needs to cross the cell and sort of transporting it across, carrying it across. So a carrier protein functions by binding to the molecule and carrying it across the membrane. Channel proteins, on the other hand, function as, you know what a channel is. It's an opening. So channel proteins form tunnels, okay? They create pores in that plasma membrane that functions as gates, okay? So these pores are going to open and close in response to cell communications and signals in order to allow for substances to pass through that cell membrane, okay? So carrier proteins, channel proteins. Carrier proteins are going to bind to the substance and sort of carry it across. Channel proteins are going to form openings, form tunnels in that plasma membrane to allow for substances to penetrate. Okay. So if we look at this illustration here, we have a plasma membrane here that's represented in this green structure. All right. We've got our polar heads facing our extracellular fluid, and we've got our nonpolar tails buried on the inside. And so transport proteins can function by carriers. They're going to bind to this protein and help to get it across, or we can create these channels or openings in the membrane to allow for substances to pass through. Other substances that I mentioned first that do not require the assistance of transport proteins can easily permeate this cell membrane by way of simple diffusion. Okay, so we said that water and gases can easily diffuse across that membrane. All right, so this picture here, when you come back to review it, just make a note that this was just illustrating to you ways in which substances can permeate this membrane. Okay, simple diffusion, okay, where these substances such as water and gases can easily, slowly albeit, but easily permeate this membrane, right? Other types of facilitated diffusion are carrier mediated, where we have these transport proteins in the plasma membrane that are going to form channels. These pores are going to be formed. Substances are going to be able to cross the membrane. Carrier proteins are going to bind to whatever substance that needs to come in and help to facilitate the crossing into the cell cytoplasm. Okay. So diffusion, I use that term diffusion. Let's make sure we're clear on what diffusion is. Diffusion is simply a process in which substances pass into or out of the cell. Okay, write this down. Diffusion is based on random motion. Okay, it does not require an input of energy. And so we'll define this as a form of passive transport. We will contrast that to active transport in just a moment. Diffusion is a form of passive transport because it does not require energy. It is based on random motion. Okay, so random motion, random movement of these molecules will happen, whether you want it to or not. Okay, many ions and small molecules can move through membranes by way of diffusion. And so an example of diffusion, okay, this random motion, if you sprayed perfume, if you're in a large room and you spray perfume and you're over in one corner, one of the four corners of the room, the fragrance that's associated with that perfume will eventually diffuse across that room. Those fragrance molecules will diffuse across that room, okay? And you'll eventually be able to smell it in either of those four corners of the room. Okay, so by definition, we're going to say that diffusion is a movement of molecules across a membrane from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So that's what's happening when you spray that perfume in your one area, in one corner of the room. It's going to be highly concentrated right there. But these molecules are going to desire to move towards equilibrium, okay? These molecules are going to continue to move based on random motion, okay, from an area of high concentration to low concentration. So you'll see that they'll diffuse across the room in an attempt to reach equilibrium. Okay, so there's two types of diffusion, right? This is passive transport, simple diffusion, where a small uncharged molecules move directly through the membrane. For example, carbon dioxide and oxygen. We know that those are easily exchanged gases. Facilitated diffusion, where we use specific types of transport proteins to make that membrane permeable to a particular solute. Okay, so the carrier mediated and transport mediated, carrier mediated, and what's the other one? I'm drawing a blank. Oh, channel mediated and carrier mediated, sorry. So another special type of diffusion is osmosis. Osmosis is a special type of diffusion where we're moving water molecules, okay? Osmosis is defined as the diffusion of water across a selectively permeable membrane from an area of higher concentration to low concentration. So water is going to pass freely through that membrane, unassisted, based on random motion, no inputs of energy. Okay. If we look at this image here, we have an illustration of osmosis. Okay, here in the middle is a represents a semi-permeable membrane. Okay, on one side of the membrane we have salt water, on the other side we have fresh water. These salt particles are eventually going to result in the diffusion of this water molecule, this salt water solution, to try and reach an equilibrium. Okay, and water will be able to pass freely through this membrane in an attempt to reach equilibrium. Okay, so those were passive transport mechanisms. Let's look at this concept of active transport. As the name suggests, active transport is going to be the movement of molecules that's going to require an input of energy. Okay, so you're moving molecules from the area of lower concentration to high concentration. Okay, when I think about active transport, I think about moving uphill, going uphill. If you try to run or walk uphill, you're going to have to exert a little bit more energy because you're kind of going against the concentration gradient. Active transport requires an input of energy, okay? And so this is just an illustration here to compare modes of transport, all right? Active transport here, as you can see, this image represents our plasma membrane, right? We already talked about some forms of passive transport where we had diffusion, where small nonpolar molecules can pass, such as gases and water. And then we saw facilitated diffusion, where we had the assistance of membrane proteins to get these substances across. Those are examples of passive transport, okay? Active transport is that we're going to need some ATP to get the job done. Okay, active transport. Let's look at two examples of active transport. Endocytosis and exocytosis. I'm sure you've heard about these mechanisms before. Endocytosis, as the name suggests, is a process in which materials are taken into the cell. Okay, those substances that we need, like glucose, right, for energy. All right, materials, waste products, for example, are ejected from the cell via exocytosis. Write these two terms down: endocytosis and exocytosis. Take some time and read about them as you go back through this lecture, okay? All right, so that's this in-class exercise you're not going to do, but you are going to do it from homework. I also, let me stop the recording.